One Sunday morning in 1961, something strange happened across Belgium. In every city, town and rural parish, the church bells began to ring. From the towering cathedrals of Brussels to the stone chapels tucked into sleepy villages, the sound echoed as one, a unified chime. Not for a holiday, not for a wedding, not for a death. No one in Belgium had died that day, at least not anyone known. And yet the bells rang loud, long, and with solemn precision. The streets slowly filled. People emerged from homes and cafes, eyes tilted toward the steeples. Some prayed, others simply stood still, listening. No explanation had been given in advance, but the newspapers would clarify by morning. The bells had rung for a town in America, but not just any town. A town with no churches. A town that had silenced its bells decades earlier. A town few Belgians had ever heard of before this day. And yet, in every church across their land, from Catholic to Protestant, bells tolled in its name. Why? What could cause an entire nation to wring its spiritual heart for a place that, by all accounts, had buried its own? To understand that moment, to feel its weight, you must return to a time and place nearly forgotten. Back before the Second World War, before the radio made stories travel. Back to a valley town hidden in the folds of rural America. Back to a silence so deep it swallowed hymns. Back to Westry Hollow, but before we unravel the secrets buried in its soil, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. What you're about to hear is not fiction. It's a thread pulled from history's neglected corner, one that still echoes quietly beneath the roar of the present. Because once, long before Belgium rang its bells, a little town chose silence, and the world forgot why. Until one woman tried to remember and one man decided to listen. It begins with a letter, a single piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, found inside a box of firewood. It was never meant to be discovered. The year was 1925, and the woman who found it had just arrived in Westry Hollow, unaware of the vow the town had made, or the price it had paid. Her name was Eliza Merrin. She was 27, unmarried, and determined to live life on her own terms. The job offer had come out of nowhere, a chance to teach in a peaceful wooded village where time seemed slower and the air cleaner. A place untouched by the bustle of cities, where folks waved from porches and children still walked to school. She took the train in early spring. The conductor, when he saw her ticket, raised an eyebrow. "Westry Hollow?" he muttered. "That's a quiet one." She smiled politely. It was exactly what she wanted. But the moment the wheels stopped at the platform and she stepped into the grey morning mist, something in her stomach tightened. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was expectancy, as though the town were holding its breath. The silence wasn't ordinary. It was thick. No birdsong, no wind. Just the soft scrape of shoes and the creak of wood. And most curiously, no bells, no chimes, no church towers in sight. She would only notice that detail later, when days passed and Sundays came and went, with no music from above. At first, she thought she had simply missed it. Then one morning she asked, and in the asking she set into motion something that had slept for over 20 years. Something buried not just beneath soil, but beneath shame. The letter would come later, but the silence had always been there, waiting. Westry Hollow wasn't on most maps. Tucked between two rivers and surrounded by dense pine forest, it looked from above like a patch of stitched farmland nestled inside a bowl of trees. A single main street, a general store, a modest schoolhouse, a train platform, and no more than 70 homes dotted along narrow dirt roads. It had a post office, a blacksmith, and a feed store. But to Eliza Merrin, what it didn't have stood out the most. No church, not one. Not even a crumbling steeple or a faded wooden cross. Nothing to suggest one had ever existed there. She noticed it her second Sunday in town. The morning light fell through her window, and for a long moment she waited, instinctively, for the sound of bells. It was what she had grown up with. Back in Hudson County, every Sunday began with pealing bronze voices marking the hour of worship. Here there was nothing but the wind through bare branches. She walked to the general store around noon. A few men stood on the porch smoking. One of them, a man with a faded red cap, nodded politely. She nodded back. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs and wood oil. Shelves of flour, soap, and glass jars lined the walls. "Good afternoon," she said to the clerk. He was tall and thin, mid-40s perhaps, with grey in his beard, and a gentle limp in his step. "Afternoon, Miss Merrin," he replied, already knowing her name. "I was wondering," she said casually, "do people here worship at home? I haven't seen a church." The man's face tightened slightly, like a muscle clenching beneath the skin. "Folks worship where they choose," he said, quietly. "I see." He didn't look up again. Later she asked one of her students, a quiet boy named Samuel, no older than 10, who had drawn a small cross on his notebook in pencil. She tapped it gently and smiled. "Is that for a church?" He looked at her with sudden alarm, then quickly erased it. I don't know," he stammered. "It was just a shape." After class, she sat in the empty schoolhouse and stared at the chalkboard. It wasn't just absence. It was avoidance. That night she wrote a letter to her sister in New York. "This town is lovely," she began. "Clean air, kind children, and warm food. But there's something strange here. A quiet that doesn't feel natural. It's not peaceful. It's heavy." The next morning she took a walk toward the southern edge of town, past the mill, across the small wooden bridge where the trees thickened. An older woman sat on a stump snapping green beans into a basket. Eliza paused and introduced herself. The woman squinted. "You're the teacher?" "Yes, ma'am." "City girl?" "Yes, but I like the quiet." The woman chuckled without smiling. "Quiet's fine. Silence is different." Eliza hesitated, then asked, "May I ask why there's no church here?" The woman stopped snapping. For a moment she didn't move at all. Then she said softly, "Some things are better left resting. I don't mean to offend." "Child, you didn't offend me. You just don't know the kind of ghosts that don't wear sheets." Eliza didn't press further. She thanked the woman and walked on, heart beating a little faster. There was something wrong beneath this town's stillness. Not malevolent, not obvious, but wrong. As if the town had swallowed a scream so long ago it forgot how to speak. She began to wonder if maybe someone had tried to tell her before. The conductor's strange glance, the hesitation in voices, the way people spoke of the past with tight lips and long pauses. Still, she wasn't afraid. Not yet. She was curious. And curiosity in a place like Westry Hollow was more dangerous than fear. Days passed, then weeks. Eliza taught her lessons, corrected papers, walked the quiet streets, and waved to neighbors who never waved first. She smiled, but the silence pressed deeper each day. It wasn't just the absence of bells. It was in the eyes of the people, their caution, their restraint, as if the town itself had signed a pact of secrecy. One evening, after a late day at the schoolhouse, she stopped by the apothecary. The shelves were lined with glass bottles and strange powders. A small fire crackled in the iron stove. Behind the counter stood Thaddeus Green, an elderly man with a crooked back and watery blue eyes. His fingers trembled slightly when he handed her a paper pouch of clove lozenges. "You're the teacher," he said, voice raspy but kind. "Yes, Eliza Merrin. I used to teach, long time ago." "Oh? Here in Westry Hollow?" He gave a slow, tired nod. "Before everything changed." She leaned slightly forward. "Do you mind if I ask, what happened here? Why there are no churches?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at her as if calculating whether she was worth the truth. Then he whispered, "They tried to silence God." Her breath caught. "I'm sorry?" "They thought if they stopped the shouting, the fires, the anger, that peace would come. But God doesn't vanish just because men close their mouths." She waited, heart racing, but Thaddeus said no more. Just handed her the lozenges, turned his back, and shuffled to a back room. That night Eliza couldn't sleep. Her dreams were restless, full of bells clanging with no sound, of flames licking skyward, and faces blurred by smoke. In the morning she took a different route to school, down Elm Street past the Weaver farm, and spotted something unusual. A hollow rectangle in a patch of overgrown weeds, ringed with crumbling stone. She stopped and studied it. The foundation of something long gone, no signs, no plaque, just emptiness. Plaque. Just... At school she asked her oldest student, a 16-year-old named Clara Jensen, if there had ever been a church near Elm. Clara's face stiffened. I don't know. Maybe before I was born." "You've lived here your whole life." Clara lowered her gaze. "My parents don't talk about it." "Why?" "I think something bad happened." Eliza waited, but Clara offered no more. Later that week she visited the town records office, a small room behind the post office run by a meticulous woman named Mrs. Haberley. Eliza smiled and asked, "Do you have any old blueprints? Town maps?" Mrs. Haberley frowned. "Why would you need that?" "For a school project," Eliza lied. "History." The woman hesitated, then pulled out a dusty drawer. rolled papers, faded ink. One map caught Eliza's eye, dated 1897. It showed two church plots marked clearly in the center of town, one on the east, one on the west. Eliza's heart beat faster. She traced the lines with her finger. "What happened to these buildings?" she asked. Mrs. Haberley's hand moved quickly, took the map back and rolled it up. "History is delicate here, Miss Merrin. I just want to understand." "You won't," the woman said sharply. "Not fully. Best to focus on what's still standing." The door behind them creaked open. A man entered, tipped his hat. Mrs. Haberley gave Eliza a tight smile and turned away. That night, she wrote another letter to her sister. "There's something buried in this town," she wrote. "Not just buildings, but memory. Something they've chosen to forget, or been forced to. One man told me they tried to silence God. I don't know what that means yet, but I intend to find out." She folded the letter and sealed it, but didn't mail it. Not yet. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the pause before each spoken word. Westry Hollow wasn't just silent. It was guarding something. And secrets, she knew, never stay buried forever. The firewood box was nearly empty. Eliza had waited too long to restock, and now the cold crept under the door and curled around her ankles. She pulled her coat tighter and opened the lid to find only bark and splinters, except for something else wedged beneath the last few chunks of oak. A tin flat and rusted at the edges, no bigger than a small book. She lifted it out, wiped the dust, and pried it open. Inside were letters, folded, yellowed, still tied with faded ribbon. She hesitated, heart thudding. There were no names on the envelopes, only dates. 1894, 1895, 1896. She sat at the table and opened the top one carefully. "My dearest James," it began, "they say we're to choose sides now, that a heart cannot love Christ without choosing which voice to hear him through. I find that impossible. For isn't love itself the truest sermon?" The signature at the bottom read, "Anna Kessler." Eliza read slowly, absorbing each word. Anna's letters spoke of a town in bloom, of church socials and choirs, of laughter carried on wind. She wrote of two pastors, one from the east side, one from the west, who had once been friends but now preached with increasing tension. Sermons turned sharp, congregations murmured warnings. Rivalry crept in where reverence once stood. In the second letter, Anna described her confusion. "James, I don't understand why Reverend Fletcher no longer greets Pastor Elijah after the Sunday service. They once prayed together. Now they barely nod." Another letter followed, this one more troubled. "I saw them arguing by the schoolyard. Words I won't repeat. Pastor Elijah said something about heresy. Reverend Fletcher called him a false shepherd. And yet both still speak of love from the pulpit." Eliza's hands trembled as she opened the fourth letter. "There's talk now of choosing which doctrine we stand under. Families whisper in corners. The Kleins won't attend the East Church anymore. The Willoughbys say the West has strayed. I fear we are splitting ourselves in two." Outside, wind howled against the walls. Eliza felt it inside her chest. The letters were real. The voices were real. And they told a story no one in Westry Hollow would dare speak aloud. Anna's last letter was the shortest. "They say the West Church burned. The flames lit the sky like a judgment. No one knows who lit the match, or so they claim. Reverend Fletcher is dead. The East Church is boarded now. I saw Pastor Elijah weeping near the ashes. James, I fear God has been driven out, not by unbelief but by pride." Eliza sat in silence. A fire had consumed one church. Death had silenced one preacher. The other was left weeping. What had happened afterward? Who had decided what came next? She returned the letters to the tin and placed it gently on her mantel beside a small vase of dried flowers. That night she dreamed of hymns sung in two voices, intertwined at first, then pulled apart by invisible hands. One voice grew louder, then angry. The other cracked like breaking glass. Flames rose behind them, and in the middle stood a young woman clutching papers, trying to speak, but no sound came. When she awoke, the dream clung to her like smoke. She walked through the schoolyard that morning in a haze, seeing not her students, but fragments of a past no one wanted her to find. But she couldn't let it go now. Anna Kessler's voice had passed through time like a whisper caught in wood and stone, and Eliza, the outsider, had been the one to hear it. Westry Hollow hadn't always been silent. It had once been full of voices. Two voices raised too high, and one voice lost in the middle. Westry Hollow had never been large, but it once had two churches. The east side belonged to Reverend Fletcher, a man of thunder and certainty. His sermons cracked like lightning, uncompromising, powerful, laced with prophecy. His flock admired his conviction. They called him God's trumpet. The West Church followed Pastor Elijah Ward, softer in voice but deep in thought. He preached of mercy, of questions without shame. His congregants loved his warmth. They called him the shepherd. For years, both men coexisted. Different styles, one faith. But by the turn of the century, something shifted. Whispers began to divide pews. Fletcher accused Elijah of softness, of letting doubt into doctrine. Elijah, in turn, warned against Fletcher's judgmental fire. Rumors swirled that the men no longer prayed together, that their eyes met only in cold silence. Anna Kessler watched it all from the back row of both churches, one Sunday here, one Sunday there. She wrote to James about the tension in the hymns, the edge in each amen. Then came the sermons. Fletcher thundered about sin wearing sheep's clothing, about the need to cast out false shepherds. Though he never named names, everyone understood. Elijah responded the next week with verses of love enduring all, of unity under Christ despite the world's divisions. He pleaded for reconciliation, but his tone had changed. There was pain in his voice. The town began to fracture. Families who once shared Sunday meals stopped speaking. Children were told which side of the river was safe. Business deals faltered. Doors closed a little quicker. Then, one night in spring 1902, flames lit the sky. The West Church burned. The blaze could be seen for miles. Timbers shrieking, windows bursting. People ran toward it. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. Only the stone foundation remained. Elijah Ward stood barefoot in the mud, face streaked with soot, robes smoldering at the hem. He said he didn't know who had started it. He said he had been at home. No one believed him. 3 days later, Elijah was found in his chapel, hands blackened from sifting through ash, eyes hollow. He had not slept. The sheriff, under pressure from Fletcher's congregants, questioned him publicly on the town square. "Did you torch your own church?" Elijah said no, said it again and again. But the murmurs were louder than his voice. 2 nights later, Reverend Fletcher was found dead in the study of the East Church. Poison, they said. No sign of struggle. The East Church closed its doors by morning. Whether Elijah fled or was forced out, no one agreed. Some claimed he vanished into the woods, never to return. Others said he moved north, became a hermit, preaching to the trees. The official story was silence. In 1 week, Westry Hollow lost both its churches, both its shepherds, and its sense of itself. And in the void, no new church rose. Because no one trusted the other side to build it. Because pain had spoken louder than scripture. Because grief had soured into shame. At a town meeting held in late June 1902, 37 heads of household gathered in the schoolhouse and voted. The motion was simple. No religious structure shall be erected within the bounds of Westry Hollow. Let peace return through quiet and quiet alone. The vote passed 29-8, and with it Westry Hollow buried its past. No memorial was placed, no sermons were held. Children were taught not to ask. By 1910, newcomers didn't even know there had been churches. By 1925, when Eliza arrived, the town's spiritual history was a ghost, unseen, unheard, but always near. And Anna Kessler, no one knew what happened to her, only that her words, once sealed in a tin box, had found breath again, and through them, the story began to stir. In the months after the East Church locked its doors, Westry Hollow fell into a hush, unlike anything it had known before. Neighbors stopped speaking across fences. Children were warned to never ask about what came before. The ground where the churches once stood remained untouched, weeds rising like sentinels around the crumbled stones. The town, still grieving, had made its choice, not to heal, but to forget. It wasn't written in law, but in something stronger, collective agreement, a silent covenant. They called it the Pact. It began informally. A father told his son, "We don't speak of sermons anymore." A shopkeeper removed the cross from his counter. A schoolteacher was told to avoid the topic in history lessons. By 1903, when a traveling preacher stopped at the general store and asked if he might hold a service, he was kindly told to move along. The next spring, a family from Ohio arrived, the Barlows. Good folk with 3 children and a love for small towns. On their second Sunday, they put up a sign in their yard, "Gathering for prayer, all welcome." Noon, no one came. By dusk, their porch had been defaced with black paint. The word "division" was smeared across their front door. They left within a week. Word spread. Newcomers were subtly briefed by the realtor, the mayor, or a neighbor. Always with a soft voice, always with firm eyes. This is a quiet town. We don't divide by doctrine here. No one ever said the word church. It became a phantom syllable, one everyone understood without speaking aloud. In time, the children grew up never knowing pews, never hearing hymns in unison. Some families prayed quietly at home, others not at all. Religion became a private language, spoken behind locked doors if spoken at all, and with that silence peace returned, or so it seemed. But it wasn't real peace. It was avoidance dressed in calm. Underneath, the old lines still ran through the soil like buried wires, humming with memory. By the time Eliza uncovered the truth, the town had spent over 20 years pretending none of it had ever happened. She shared Anna's letters with Harold Boone, the editor of the Westry Gazette. He was in his 50s, sharp-eyed, with ink-stained fingers and a quiet passion for truth. At first he laughed. "Where'd you find these?" "In my woodbox." "Could be fiction." "I don't think so." He read them again, slowly this time. When he finished, he looked at her differently. "You want to write about this?" "Yes." "You'll make enemies." "I already have questions. I'd rather have answers." They began gathering old maps, tax records, photographs. Harold published a brief column, just a hint, a whisper, remembering the East and West. The response was immediate. Anonymous letters arrived at the paper, some furious, others pleading. One simply read, "Let the dead stay buried." Someone threw a rock through Harold's office window. Then late one night, Eliza's front steps were set ablaze. The fire didn't spread, but the message was clear. She found a note nailed to her door. "Silence saved us. Don't bring it back." The next day, Harold warned her, "They'll turn on you fast. They're not cruel, Eliza. They're afraid. This town learned to survive by forgetting, and you're trying to make it remember." "I don't want to stir anger. Truth always stirs something." She considered leaving. But the weight of Anna's words, of Pastor Elijah's broken face, of children who'd never heard a hymn, it was too much to walk away from. She decided to write it all down, not for the paper, for a book, a full account, the town's hidden gospel. If no one else would speak, she would. But Westry Hollow had other plans, and silence, once broken, does not go quietly. By spring of 1947, Eliza Merrin had become more than the schoolteacher. She was the outsider who asked too much, remembered too well, and refused to let silence win. Her house became a place of questions, of whispered stories and cautious confessions. Old farmers stopped by at dusk, claiming to return a borrowed book, only to stay and speak of what they saw as children. Fires in the night, fathers who came home with soot on their boots, mothers who wept in silence. She took notes, carefully, discreetly. Each page added to the manuscript she now called the Hollow Covenant. It wasn't meant to accuse, it wasn't an exposé, it was a remembrance. A call for healing through honesty, through reckoning. Harold Boone helped where he could. He read chapters as they came, offering edits and encouragement. "You're building something real," he told her once. "Even if they burn it down, you'll know you tried." But others were not as kind. The local grocer doubled her prices, the bakery stopped delivering. Her students' parents grew colder, some withdrawing their children entirely. Anonymous letters filled her mailbox, some pleading, others cruel. Then Harold's dog was poisoned. No proof, no witnesses, just the body on the back steps, and a note tucked under its collar. "Words cost more than you know." That night, Harold sat in Eliza's kitchen, staring into his tea. "We need to leave it alone," he said quietly. "You don't believe that." "I believe we're alone in this, and we've stirred a town full of sleeping fear." Eliza folded her hands. "Then maybe fear needs to wake up." But fear doesn't sleep quietly. A week later, she came home to find her door ajar. Drawers pulled open, pages torn, her desk split. The manuscript, gone. She stood frozen, eyes scanning the wreckage. The tin box of letters had been taken, even Anna's words, stolen by hands too afraid to hear them. But on the floor, beneath an overturned chair, she found one page left untouched. The first line she'd ever written. "There is no peace in silence, only delay." She didn't cry, she packed what she could. 2 days later, before sunrise, she left Westry Hollow. She didn't say goodbye. Not to Harold, not to the school, not to the house where truth had once lived. She took a train north, then east. No one knew exactly where she went. Rumors said she married. Others said she disappeared into a convent. Some claimed she died in the war. The town for a while seemed to breathe easier without her. But something lingered, a feeling that the silence wasn't safe anymore, that somewhere out there the truth still existed. Harold, for his part, stayed. He never spoke of the manuscript again, never published another word about the churches, but he kept a drawer locked in his office, and every so often, late at night, he would open it, read the one surviving page, and whisper her name. Eliza. The woman who refused to forget. Time moved on. A new teacher came. New families arrived, never told the full story. The pact held, cracked but intact. But the wind had changed. Some children, in secret, drew crosses again on paper. A few elders whispered memories to grandchildren in hushed tones in the dark. And in Belgium, thousands of miles away, a young scholar would one day stumble across a box of forgotten letters. But that, of course, is another part of the story. For now, all that remained in Westry Hollow was absence. No churches, no bells, and one name, etched quietly into the town's conscience, like a distant toll that wouldn't fade. Eliza. In the fall of 1952, in a quiet university library in Leuven, Belgium, a theology student named Luc Dumont found a manuscript buried between volumes of forgotten Americana. It was thin, brittle with age, and entirely in English. The cover bore no title, only a name written in faded ink, E. Merrin. He was not searching for it. He had been researching early 20th century religious migrations for a lecture, but the manuscript caught his attention like a whisper amid thunder. He opened it and read the first line. There is no peace in silence, only delay. Intrigued, Luke checked it out and devoured it in 2 nights. The story inside was unlike anything he had encountered. Not a fable, not a sermon, but a raw personal chronicle of division, loss, and memory. It read like confession, lament, and quiet resistance all at once. The story of Westry Hollow. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was Eliza Merrin? How had her manuscript ended up across the ocean, inside an old Jesuit donation box in Leuven? He asked his professor, Father Willem. Willem raised his eyebrows. Ah, the hollow town, yes, a few whispered about it years ago. Some thought it metaphor, others heresy. But the places, the names, it's too detailed to be fiction. Truth is rarely loud, Luke, but it echoes if you listen. Luke requested access to the restricted archive. Inside he found more fragments, 3 torn pages of handwritten notes, bearing verses from Isaiah and Matthew, cross-referenced with mentions of division and reconciliation, all in the same slanted handwriting. The archivist confirmed the papers had come from a Belgian woman named Sister Margaretha, who had died in 1949. Her real name, it turned out, was Eliza Merrin. Luke sat in stunned silence. She had become a nun. Somehow, after fleeing Westry Hollow, she had crossed the ocean and found sanctuary in Belgium, and in her final years she had translated her manuscript into French and submitted it, quietly, anonymously, to a religious academic circle. No one published it, but someone preserved it. Luke spent the next months piecing together what he could. He wrote to archives in America. He requested county records, school rosters, property deeds. Most inquiries went unanswered, but one envelope arrived with a faded photo inside, a school portrait dated 1926. A woman stood at the end of the back row, one hand on a boy's shoulder. Her eyes were sharp, steady. Luke knew it was her. He began to speak of Westry Hollow in lectures, not as a scandal, but as a question. What happens when faith becomes too loud to hear? Some students laughed, others listened, a few wept. He published an article in a small religious journal titled "The Town That Outlawed God." It caused a minor stir, just enough to be translated by a priest in Liège, then discussed in a circle of Belgian bishops. It became a conversation. How could a Christian town choose silence? What did it mean to forsake churches in search of peace? And more hauntingly, were they wrong? Luke continued his research, but he never found a definitive answer. Westry Hollow remained elusive. He could trace its coordinates, its census rolls, even property ledgers, but no clear photo of a church remained. No public record of the fire, just pieces, shadows. Still he persisted, because in that quiet story he saw something larger, a mirror. Europe too knew about schisms, about neighbors turned enemies over dogma. about cities rebuilt with faith stitched shut. Westry Hollow in its silence had become a symbol, not of heresy but of warning. And Luke, once a curious student, was becoming something more, a steward of memory. One day he told himself he would go there, not to preach, but to listen, because perhaps, just perhaps, the town wasn't lost. It was waiting. In the spring of 1955, Father Luc Dumont boarded a steamer across the Atlantic. He carried a worn leather satchel containing Eliza's manuscript, a journal filled with his own notes, and a single purpose: to find Westry Hollow. He didn't announce his journey. There were no articles, no letters of introduction, just a quiet hope that something still waited there, something unhealed. The train from Boston wound south through forest and farmland until it reached the town where the tracks ended. From there, Luke hired a driver who squinted at the name on the paper. "Westry Hollow?" the man said. "That place still around?" Luke smiled politely. "That's what I'm hoping." The car stopped at the edge of town. Westry Hollow looked just as Eliza had described. Modest homes, a central square, children on bicycles. But no steeples, no bells, no trace of what had once been sacred. He stayed at the only boarding house. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Prim, eyed him warily when she saw his collar. "You're not here to start anything, are you?" "No, ma'am," Luke replied. "Only to listen." She said nothing more but handed him the key without warmth. Over the next few days, he walked. He visited the old schoolhouse, bought bread from the same shop Eliza once did, sat on benches and watched the townspeople move in quiet rhythm. No one greeted him, no one asked questions, but he felt eyes watching. At night, he wrote in his journal, "This silence feels deliberate, not empty, guarded. They have not forgotten. They have only learned how to hide." On Sunday morning, Luke did not dress in robes. He did not gather a crowd. Instead, he rose early, walked the perimeter of the town, and at each corner he left a candle, unlit, unmarked, just a small flame waiting for breath. He returned each evening to find them untouched. On the fifth day, he was approached by an old man near the mill. "You're not the first to come," the man said, "but you might be the first to stay quiet." "I came to understand," Luke answered. "You'll find nothing written, no sermons, just people tired of choosing sides." Luke nodded. "Even silence is a kind of doctrine." The old man stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "There's an orchard on the west end. Look under the third tree." That night Luke followed the path, past broken fences and tall grass. Under the third tree, he found a rusted tin box. Inside were 6 pages, handwritten testimonies, some unsigned, others bearing first names only. A boy describing the night his father came home with burned hands. A woman recalling a wedding that ended in screams when the guests argued over which pastor should speak. A teenager writing about the sound of bells she had only heard once. Luke read each page with reverence. These were not accusations, they were confessions. People trying to make sense of a town that had cut out its voice to save itself from further breaking. The next morning, Luke copied the testimonies word for word into his notebook. He made no copies. He didn't photograph them, only the words. Then he returned the tin to the earth and covered it gently. He knew he had to leave soon, but he also knew this was not the end. Back at the boarding house, Mrs. Prim handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. "No return address," she said. "Just came today." Inside was a single object, a bell clapper, old, worn but intact. Luke stared at it for a long time, then smiled. Somewhere in the quiet, a sound was preparing to return, not to preach, but to remember. In early 1959, The Hollow Town was published in Belgium. Luc Dumont had spent years refining Eliza's manuscript, pairing it with the anonymous testimonies, his own reflections and historical fragments. It was not a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. It was passed hand to hand, quietly, like a relic of something fragile and holy. Priests read it behind altar doors. Seminary students discussed it in whispers. A few dismissed it as fiction. Others, especially those raised in the shadow of war and division, recognized something deeply familiar in its pages. It spoke of fear that wore the mask of peace, of good people choosing quiet over conflict, of love suffocated by doctrine, and of one woman who dared to remember when no one else would. The Catholic Bishop of Namur wrote in his diary, "This is not a history, it is a mirror." In Protestant circles, debate rippled. Was Eliza's rejection of both churches blasphemy or revelation? Did her silence reflect failure or strength? And yet, even amid disagreement, there was unity in one thought. The bells must ring, not in America but here in Belgium, to mark, not a tragedy, but a moment of reconciliation. Planning began in secret, not as spectacle, but as ceremony. Quiet letters passed among clergy of every denomination. A date was chosen, March 12, 1961. No major holiday, no death to commemorate, just a Sunday like any other. But this time, at precisely 9 a.m., the bells would toll, not for a pope, not for a king, but for a town that once silenced itself in the name of peace, and for a world still trying to learn what that cost. On the eve of the ringing, Luke visited the convent where Eliza had spent her final years. The sisters remembered her well, gentle, private, always writing. She had died quietly, they told him. No family, no grave with a name. He left a single candle on her windowsill. The next morning the bells began. In Bruges they rang slow and deep, in Ghent high and bright. In small villages, little chapels shook with sudden song. Children looked up, confused. Old men wept. Some congregations paused mid-sermon, unsure if this was a signal or mistake. But word spread quickly. By noon, newspapers began to print the reason. Across headlines in 3 languages. For Westry Hollow. For a town without churches. For voices lost and found. For memory reclaimed through sound. In America, no such bells rang. Westry Hollow did not know. Or perhaps it did. Because at 9:03 a.m. local time, a man walking alone on a wooded trail near the center of town heard something strange. A faint chime. Once. Then silence. He stopped, turned around and saw no one. Only a hill where a church once stood. Only the wind in the pines. Only the sensation that something had shifted. That someone, somewhere, had forgiven them. Later that day, a young girl named Mabel Carter, leafing through the dusty stacks of the schoolhouse attic, found a loose board behind a shelf. Inside, she discovered a bundle of pages, handwritten, smudged, still intact. The first line read, "There is no peace in silence, only delay." She did not understand it yet, but she would. The morning after the bells rang across Belgium, the headlines reached every parish office, seminary, and bishopric in the country. Most read them in silence. A few read them aloud to their congregations. But all of them, in one way or another, asked the same question. What does it mean to ring bells for a town that silenced its own? At the Archdiocese of Mechelen-Brussels, a council was called. 12 men in robes and collars sat at a long oak table beneath a stained glass dome. On the table sat 2 objects, a marked copy of the Hollow Town and a hand-drawn map of rural America, with a circle around Westry Hollow. One bishop, young, soft-spoken, opened the meeting. "Are we honoring a tragedy?" he asked. "Or sanctifying an error?" An older cardinal spoke next. "We are honoring confession. We are sounding grace for those who could not give it to each other." A priest raised his hand. "But they turned from the church, burned their own sanctuaries, rejected both shepherds." "And still," another replied, "they longed for peace." Arguments followed. Some saw the bells as blasphemy. Others called them a gesture of healing. Some wanted to write to the Vatican for guidance. Others feared scrutiny. The Hollow Town, after all, was not officially sanctioned. It carried no imprimatur, no theological commentary, just raw memory. Then Bishop Henri Malliet, the eldest among them, stood and said, "Perhaps we are asking the wrong questions." They turned to him. He spoke slowly. They did not burn the churches to erase God. They burned them in the fire of division. They chose silence not because they lost faith, but because they lost trust in men, in institutions, in doctrine wielded like a weapon, and in that silence they tried to find stillness. He paused. They failed, yes, but in their failure there is something holy. A hush followed, then a vote was called, not on whether the bells should have rung, they already had, but on what should come next. The proposal was simple, a commemorative volume, not to be sold, not to be published commercially, but to be printed in limited number and placed in every major seminary in Belgium. A volume including Eliza Merrin's manuscript, Luc Dumont's annotations, and theological reflections from both Catholic and Protestant scholars. It passed unanimously. Luc was invited to lead the project. He accepted with one request, that Eliza's name appear on the cover, no pseudonym, no initials, her full name. Eliza Merrin, Westry Hollow, USA. Some objected. She left the church, one priest murmured. She never left faith, Luke replied. The work began. Over the following months, transcripts were retyped. Footnotes were added sparingly, respectfully. Scholars offered reflections, not to explain the story, but to honor its weight. One essay, written by a Lutheran theologian, bore the title, The Sound Between Bells. Another, from a Jesuit monk, When Doctrine Divides and Memory Heals. As the volume neared completion, plans emerged to mark the anniversary of the ringing, not with more bells, but with silence. A chosen hour where no church in Belgium would make a sound. 1 hour of stillness, in honor of those who had lived in silence too long. The idea caught on. Churches in France and Germany agreed to join. Some towns in the Netherlands too. A quiet wave. No declarations, no ceremonies, just absence. Meant this time not to bury, but to remember. Luke sat with the final draft in his lap one evening, staring out at the dim cathedral square. He thought of Eliza, of her first step onto the platform in Westry Hollow, of the voices that tried to stop her, and the ones she revived anyway, of the bell clapper sent anonymously, of the girl, Mabel, who now held her pages in trembling hands. Luke knew the bells had done something no sermon could. They had listened. Now it was time for the rest of the world to do the same. The sun rose slowly over Belgium on March 12, 1961, in cathedrals and stone chapels, on ivy-covered college grounds and in tiny brick parishes. Clergy stepped into bell towers with steady hands. Some wore robes. Others came in plain coats. There were no processions, no choirs, no announcements from pulpits, only the bells. At 9 a.m. they began, first in Leuven, where Eliza's manuscript had been found, then in Antwerp, Namur, Bruges. In rural villages where no one had heard of Westry Hollow, people paused their breakfast and listened. Some didn't ask why. Others whispered stories half-remembered. Luke stood beneath the belfry of Saint Michel's church, eyes closed, palms open, as the chimes thundered overhead. The sound was clear. Not joyful, not mournful, just steady. One tone followed by another. Bells in harmony. He thought of Eliza standing alone in that town, staring at walls that refused to echo. He imagined her hearing this sound, not as noise, but as proof, that the silence had not swallowed her whole, that someone had heard. Across Belgium, a small group of former seminary classmates gathered in a rented room in Ghent. One of them read aloud from the hollow town. She asked, not to accuse, but to remember, and in that memory, she found the outlines of forgiveness. In a convent in Liège, nuns gathered in quiet prayer beside the framed photograph of Eliza. It had been placed there the night before by an elder sister who had known her, briefly long ago. Back in America, the Sunday began like any other. The papers made no mention of Belgium. No one in Westry Hollow expected anything different. But at 9:03 a.m., an odd sound stirred near the East Ridge. A soft vibration, metal on stone, distant and brief. Most assumed it was wind, or some echo from the train yard beyond the trees, but a few stopped in their tracks. They turned toward the hill. An old man walking his dog removed his hat and stood still. He had no words for what he felt, only that something old had moved inside him. Later that day, the mail arrived. In the schoolhouse library, now mostly used for storage, Mabel Carter unfolded the pages she had found. The handwriting was faint, but legible. She read slowly. The words confused her. Talk of fire, sermons, sorrow, but they clung to her. She read them again, then again. She copied one sentence in her own notebook. We tried to make peace by closing our mouths. But peace must be spoken to be real. The page fluttered in her small hands like a leaf too dry to cling. She didn't know who Eliza was, but she knew she had found something important. She brought the manuscript to her grandmother, who read the first few lines in silence. Her eyes widened. "I remember that name," she whispered. "They told us not to speak it." Mabel looked at her, confused. "Why?" Her grandmother didn't answer. That night, in homes across town, some of the older residents sat by their radios, flipping between stations. One Belgian broadcast made it through, its signal faint but clear. The bells tolled this morning across Belgium, in unity for a forgotten American town, a gesture of reconciliation, not doctrine. A memorial to division overcome not by victory, but by understanding. They listened, unsure what to feel. Some turned it off, but others listened all the way through. For the first time in decades, Westry Hollow had been named again. Not in anger, not in shame, but in honor. And though no bells rang there, something deeper had stirred. Not a sound, but a shift. The first thread of a silence unraveling. Spring came to Westry Hollow with the scent of thawed earth and budding trees. The kind of quiet that once meant safety now felt different, thinner, more uncertain, as if the silence had begun to fray at the edges. Mabel Carter kept reading. She brought Eliza's manuscript to school, hiding it between math books and geography charts. Each afternoon, when the final bell rang, she waited until the room emptied, and then returned to the back of the library where no one checked anymore. She read the story in fragments, about the town before, about the fire, about the pact. She didn't understand every detail, but she felt the weight of the words. A weight that didn't crush but pulled her toward something, an ache she hadn't known she carried. One sentence stayed with her. Truth begins when one voice speaks where silence was demanded. She copied it onto a scrap of paper and kept it in her coat pocket. One morning she showed the page to her friend Lewis Harlan, a lanky boy who always asked too many questions in class. He read it, then looked at her sideways. "Where'd you get this?" She hesitated. "It was hidden in the school. It's from someone who lived here before. She wrote about what happened. What happened when? A long time ago." Lewis glanced around. They were alone. "Read me more." So she did. That afternoon, and the next, and the next. Soon, Hazel, Daniel, and Rosie joined them. By the end of the week, there were 6. They met in the school side room where old desks were stacked like forgotten bones. There, Mabel read aloud while the others listened, wide-eyed and silent. They asked questions no one else dared to ask. Why did the churches burn? Why didn't anyone build new ones? Why did people stop talking about it? Mabel didn't have the answers, but she had the words, and the words were enough to begin something. Lewis brought a Bible from his grandfather's attic, dusty, leather-bound, with underlined verses in red pencil. He read from Matthew, and Rosie recited a psalm her mother had taught her in secret. No one preached. No one told the others what to believe. They just spoke, softly, carefully, like touching glass for the first time in a lifetime. One Friday, Mabel brought a candle. They lit it, and sat for an hour in silence. But it wasn't the same silence that had haunted the town for decades. This one was chosen, shared, open. That night, Hazel told her mother. The next day, Hazel didn't come to the reading. No explanation, just a quiet absence. The others kept meeting. Word spread as whispers do. Some adults scoffed, others frowned, but no one stopped them. Perhaps the town had grown tired of stopping things, or perhaps they, too, were listening again. At the general store, Mr. Dowell began placing a jar on the counter, labeled "For Light," without saying what it meant. Coins appeared in it anyway. One afternoon, Mabel found an envelope tucked into the manuscript's pages. Inside was a note written in a hand she didn't recognize. "Your voice is not alone. Keep reading." There was no name, just the drawing of a small bell. The children decided to write down their thoughts, reflections, questions, prayers. They placed them in a shoebox hidden beneath the old library stairs. One boy asked, "Can we forgive people who are already dead?" Another wrote, "I don't want to be afraid of God anymore." Mabel added her own, "Eliza, I'm sorry we buried your voice, but we've heard it now, and we won't let it go quiet again." In the town that had once outlawed its own soul, 6 children lit a candle and passed it hand to hand. And though the world didn't notice, Westry Hollow had begun to stir, not in defiance, but in remembrance. By summer, something unspoken had begun to shift in Westry Hollow. It didn't start with sermons or declarations, but with footsteps. Children walking together at dusk toward the edge of town. No banners, no signs, just quiet motion. They met under the sycamore trees near the west field, where the foundation stones of a long-lost church still sat like scattered bones. Mabel brought a cloth. Lewis brought matches. Rosie carried the candle. They lit it and waited. One by one, the others arrived. 9, then 12, then 15. They did not sing hymns, though Hazel sometimes hummed a tune her grandmother once whispered. They did not read from pulpits, but passed around verses. Psalms, parables, proverbs. Each night ended the same way. Silence, not imposed, chosen. A silence that held space for thought, not fear. By the third week, a woman named Mrs. Ellen Brewster came. She had once sung in the East Church choir before the fire. Now she sat at the edge of the circle, tears on her cheeks, hands folded, saying nothing. That was enough. Others followed. Old men who hadn't spoken of the churches since their father's time. Mothers who remembered the fire, but had buried the memory under decades of daily life. They said little, but they came. Soon the children's shoebox, once hidden under the library stairs, became a book of its own, filled with folded notes, questions, hopes. It passed between hands, added to with care. I don't remember the sound of bells, but I think I can imagine them now. If the past can hurt us, can it also heal us? We are not choosing sides. We're choosing each other. One evening, Lewis stood up and read aloud a story from Eliza's manuscript, the part where Anna wrote about love as the truest sermon. Afterward, no one spoke, but two people held hands who hadn't in years, and someone cried softly into the crook of their coat. The town's silence had cracked, not with noise, but with attention. Reverent, trembling attention. Then came the night Mabel found something in the ground. She'd been walking home along the northern ridge when her shoe struck metal. She knelt and dug gently. A bell, small, dust-covered, cracked, but whole. She carried it back, cradled in her arms. No one knew how long it had been buried. Perhaps a relic from one of the burned churches. Perhaps something older. But they knew what to do. They placed it on the stone altar where the West Church once stood. They didn't ring it, not yet. Instead, they sat around it, waiting, listening, not for answers, but for readiness. The next morning, word had spread. More people came, not hundreds, but enough. The town didn't hold a vote, there was no proclamation, but one by one voices returned, not in unison, not scripted, just spoken. Mabel's father stood before the group and said, "My grandfather helped build one of those churches, and then helped tear it down. I've never known what to do with that truth, until now." Hazel's grandmother recited the Lord's Prayer. Rosie's older brother sang the first line of a hymn, trembling. No one stopped him, no one silenced him. That night, as the candle burned lower than usual, Lewis turned to Mabel and asked, "Do you think it's time?" She didn't answer. She simply stood, walked to the bell, and touched the rim with her fingers. She looked around. No one objected, so she picked it up, held it to the air, and let it ring. Once. The sound was thin, but real. Not perfect, but true. A single chime, echoing through the valley that had once sealed its voice. That echo rolled through trees, across fields, between homes where windows lit slowly with quiet light. The bell fell silent again, but no one feared the silence anymore, because now it had been filled. Years passed. Westry Hollow never rebuilt its churches. No steeples rose, no pews returned, but the silence had changed. What once had been imposed by fear was now held with choice, with care. The town did not fill the valley with sermons, but it no longer recoiled from the sound of prayer. On the first Sunday of every spring, the townspeople gathered at the stone foundation on the western hill. There, under the sycamores, they lit a candle. They read from the shoebox book, which now bore dozens of hands in its binding. Each year, one child was chosen to ring the bell. It never rang loud, but it rang, and that was enough. Mabel Carter grew up. She became a teacher like Eliza. She never left Westry Hollow, though she travelled often. Once she visited Belgium and stood beneath the belfry where Luc Dumont had stood decades before. She left a note at the chapel door. She was heard. We remember her. Thank you. Back home, Lewis took over the town's archive project. He restored maps, interviewed elders, compiled the oral history no one had dared speak before. Rosie painted murals across the school's west wing, depictions of trees, flames, candles, bells, and an open book. Hazel wrote poetry. Daniel became a carpenter and built benches along the path to the foundation site. He carved a line into the wood. Memory is the altar where truth kneels. One winter, a letter arrived from Belgium. Luc Dumont had passed away peacefully. His final journal entry, enclosed with the letter, read, "She taught me that silence can be loud and that to remember is a holy act." I never rang a bell for myself, but I hope someone someday will read what she wrote and understand why I listened. They framed it beside Eliza's original page, preserved in glass. The manuscript never saw commercial release, No film was made, no monument erected, but the story lived, not through headlines or statues, but through the rhythm of quiet voices choosing to speak, choosing again and again to remember what once broke them and what healed them slowly. One bell, one voice, one memory passed to another, and now, to you, because you've walked with us. You've heard what many tried to silence. You've seen what happens when faith is weaponized and when silence becomes refuge instead of resolution. But most importantly, you've seen how remembrance becomes restoration. If this story moved you, if it stirred something you didn't know you carried, subscribe to this channel now. Let us continue telling the stories that others left behind, because stories like this don't end, they echo. And if you'd like to follow that echo one step further, click on the video now appearing on your screen. The next journey is waiting. A different town, a different silence, but the same question. What happens when truth waits too long to be spoken?